Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's role in making other worlds. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. There's this one idea of education that's probably pretty familiar to a lot of people, and it's the idea that education is a thing you obtain. It's a place you go to, it's something that certifies you, it's a status you have, right? You might say, I'm educated, or I got my education here. But maybe there's another way of thinking about education. That education's not something that you start and stop. And that doesn't mean that it's just lifelong learning. In fact, education in this understanding might be more about unlearning. It's the idea that through unlearning and through study, there's something more radical possible. That instead of finding your place in the world, education can be about challenging the order of things and seeking out other ways of knowing and other ways of being and working collectively to build new projects. This podcast borrows its name from a slogan of the rebellious collective communities, the Zapatistas in southern Mexico. The idea is that we can do more than just make small reforms while maintaining the order of things. Instead, as they say, another world is possible. As a way of introducing this podcast focus, I think I should more fully introduce myself. I'm a professor of education working in anthropology and migration studies. I live in Philadelphia, and as such, I'm obligated to be a Philadelphia sports fan. And also, I'm Jewish. My childhood memories are filled with Passover at my Bubby and Zadie's house, messing around with my best friend Abe during Sunday school, watching Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm with my dad. There's a very particular kind of Judaism that's been very important to my educational life and to my cultural identity. And for about the last 15 years or so, I've also been an anti-Zionist. My educational journey from being raised in Zionist worlds to where I am now, which is working toward a free Palestine, has had many teachers. And my own journey is going to fit into the background of this podcast, because in the foreground, we're going to hear from Jews who have made monumental shifts in the type of educational work that they do, seeing how education fits into their work toward Palestinian liberation. Over the next episodes, you'll hear from Israelis, Americans, former IDF soldiers. We'll be talking to boomers who have been organizing against the genocide. We're going to learn about intergenerational solidarity. We're going to speak to scholars of memory and memorial. We'll learn about radical study groups and what's been happening with university encampments, and there'll be much, much else. Each interview will include 3 broad moves. First, we'll hear how people had an educational world that was made for them. Second, we'll look at how they began to unlearn or challenge or break from that educational world. And third, we'll hear how they're working toward another more liberatory future, specifically as it relates to Palestine. We just want to note, finally, that we come to this work as educators. And as such, we hope to meet folks where they are, but challenge them not to stay there. Today's episode is an interview with my friend and colleague, Dr. Raz Segal. We should note that the episode was recorded several months ago. Since then, Raz was appointed director of the University of Minnesota's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. That appointment was then rescinded in no small part because of Raz's work naming and speaking out against the genocide. Raz is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and an endowed professor in the study of modern genocide at Stockton University. Raz has written 2 books on the Holocaust, and he is now working on a new book project that will involve a critical account of the history and memory of Holocaust bystanders. He's also working on another book that will offer a new analysis of Israeli mass violence from the 1948 Nakba to the current genocidal assault on Gaza. Raz has lived in Cupertino, Tel Aviv, Budapest, Vienna, Cambridge, Mass., and, since 2016, in Philadelphia. But it was his trips in India a long time ago that sparked his interest in genocide. Raz identifies first and foremost as a Jew, and yes, he understands that this could mean very different things. That's actually the point. So, welcome, Raz. How are you?
Hi, Jordan. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being our first guest. So we're gonna dig into your life, your history, your educational journey, and I just want to start at the very beginning. What did childhood look like? Tell me about growing up in Israel and California.
One of the things that I remember very clearly is actually a feeling. It's a feeling of very strong and deep belonging, right? And that also, related to that, the feeling that the world is actually simple, right? There's good guys and there are bad guys. We're the good guys. um, and it's also it's a small place, Israel. A lot of people are live close by and are very tied in various ways to their families. And sometimes we also, as a grown up, when I lived in Israel before I came to Philadelphia in 2016, me and my partner and our daughter also lived very close to our families. Which then strengthens this sense of belonging and this I would say sense of security, actually, right? And then it's this is also all these feelings that I'm talking about, right? They manifest themselves in different ways, right? So for example, I remember and this is, more maybe as a teenager, feeling very attached to the place, right? So, for example, I remember believing that the mountains in the north of Israel, the Galil Mountains, right, are just, they have to be the most beautiful mountains in the world. Now, the Galil Mountains are beautiful, right? And there's some incredibly amazing spots, but they're not the most beautiful mountains in the world. But that just gives you a sense of what it means actually, really, or what it meant to me. And this, it might sound superficial or maybe even, I don't know, stupid, right? But what it meant to me, the sense of belonging, right? And the sense of perhaps even security, right? How in this imagination of the mountains and the Galil is the most beautiful in the world. And then, above all of this, and this, I think relates to our discussion, there is this idea that Israel is a unique place, right? And it's a unique place because Jews are a unique people, and this is really based on the idea that Jews and Israel are the same, right? This feeling. So I mean, it's not that I didn't know that there are Jews elsewhere in the world, right? It's just that it mattered not at all, right? It's not, and this is very important. It's not a denial of the fact that there are Jews outside of Israel, or that Jews had lived in the world for like thousands of years before Israel, right? It's actually the fact that it's irrelevant. It's completely pushed to the margin. So I think the concept that captures this very well is disavowal, right? It doesn't matter, right? And what matters is that Jews are unique, right? They're special. And Jews is Israel. Israel is unique and special. And of course, above that, there's this idea that, again, without knowing anything actually about, I have to say, about Jewish history, right, or Jewish culture, or actually even about Judaism, right, as a religion, but also without knowing anything about the Holocaust, right? So this, because above this idea that Israel is special and Jews are special, is the idea that the Holocaust is unique, right? And that as a result of the Holocaust, we have this unique state, this unique people. And this, again, manifests itself in various ways. You can think about the idea that the Israeli army is the most moral army in the world, right? Which, of course, from my standpoint today, it's, an absurd and ridiculous idea to think about any army, right? But I really felt that way, right? That's the point, I think, and I always say, I also tell students, I'm not a genius, but I'm also not stupid, right? And I really felt that Israel is unique, that the Israeli army is indeed the most moral army in the world, and that Jews are unique, and this is a great place, And I remember, like, it also has to do with like the details of these feelings, right? Say the atmosphere that I remember of like a Friday afternoon as the week ends and we enter the weekend, and this kind of, so it's tied to these kinds of really personal, I think, feelings, but that have like this kind of public atmosphere to them. Now, with all of this, of course, um, there's not just a disavowal of the fact that there's much more to Jews than Israel, right? Past and present, right? But there's, of course, the disavowal of any kind of significant history of the place, right? And again, it's not a denial. I have to say, when I grew up, there was very little, or not at all, actually, I have to say, like denial, say, of the Nakba or things. No, because no one, I mean, it was just irrelevant, right? You could actually live without realizing that there's Palestinians under occupation. And seriously, and when I was like, in fifth grade, for example, there was the first Intifada, right? Which I do remember. But it was like also this kind of, almost outburst, which gives you it just wasn't present in the life, at least as a kid, right? But I think more broadly, right? So this kind of disavowal, not like a denial, right? Which is much more common today, right, in Israel, but this pushing it to the margins in order to maintain this idea that really, which is completely without history or context or anything, like of Holocaust, Israel, Jews as something unique and special and unbelievably worthy. Right?
Yeah. It's interesting that there's such an affective element here of that belonging was learned through intensities and feelings, not so much a specific lesson. But were there teachers, were family, community members, people that you were living with actively teaching this sense of belonging?
No. It's really something that kind of I grew up with, right, around me. Again, it's a small place. It's, the families are very close, right, in terms of, physical proximity. And these kind of general ideas, I mean, at least in my experience, right, about the Holocaust. I mean, and my family are from Bulgarian and Romanian backgrounds. So it's actually much more marginal stories in the Holocaust story, actually, Romania and Bulgaria. But, there was some family storytelling to this, perhaps, but not a lot, right? And much more actually from my grandfather on my mother's side was Bulgarian Jews, which is again a very particular kind of Holocaust story. But it wasn't, it was much more, I think, based mostly on this element of disavowal, right? This kind of timeless, I would almost, decontextualized, disembedded sense of uniqueness and exceptionality.
Yeah. Perhaps kind of a hidden curriculum of Israel's uniqueness.
Yeah.
The uniqueness of Jewish folks. Did this extend to school? Was this appearing when you're a fourth and fifth grader going to primary school in Israel?
Well, we came back, I went to fifth grade when I came back from California. No, I have to say, I don't, again, I don't remember any of this. I do remember, actually, strangely, that among the kids, fifth grade kids, right, we had all kinds of like discussions in relation to the first Intifada, right, which were mostly about, in the way I remember them, right, about basically this question of whether we, Israel, right, should or should not give back the occupied territories, right? But there were like, fifth graders. It was very, we didn't know anything, obviously. Also, give back to who, right?
Yeah.
No one knew. Israel is actually a very segregated society, right? Most Jews in Israel, certainly those who don't come from Arab-speaking homes, right, don't know Arabic, have no significant interactions with Palestinians, right, or more broadly Arabic culture or history or anything like that. So it was like very superficial. So we were aware that there's like this intifada, right? But other than that, I mean, I don't remember the teachers say intervening in this any way or providing any guidance or nothing. No.
Were there elementary school classes just on a basic sense of Israeli history, Holocaust history?
Not that I can remember, actually, I have to say, right? I mean,
That's
there's
interesting.
more, in middle school, high school, but again, nothing that like left a mark on me, right? Nothing that was like very significant. It was actually, I have to say that probably even in high school, right, I was not aware of the Nakba, right? And that's not because anyone told us there was never a Nakba, right? It's just not aware of it at all, right? This very successful pushing it to the margins that it's completely irrelevant. And I have to say that, that is despite the fact that my grandfather, right? So here's a bit of a story that could, so my grandfather, my Bulgarian grandfather, when they came in the very late 40s, right, 49, from Bulgaria, and he was offered a job in what became Bank Leumi in Israel, and it came with like a Palestinian house in Ramle, a Palestinian city that had been very thoroughly ethnically cleansed in the Nakba in 1948 war, and he refused, right? And I remember hearing this story, right, from him, right? But again, not in any significant detail. And of course, the vast majority of people did not refuse, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. And what that refusal just didn't even register with you?
It
Beyond.
did. It did register. It did register, but there was there was not a lot. I didn't ask, a lot of questions about it. There was not a lot more I mean, the story itself is significant, right?
Yeah.
But there was not a lot more to it, Yeah, I mean, and I have to say, it was really only as an adult that I really started to learn, right, about Israeli history, about Palestinian history, that I started to be aware, right, of Palestinians as a people. So very, very late in my life.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that'll be really interesting to delve into how do you go from having these small conversations on the playground, hearing small stories from your grandfather, to where you are now, and in between, we'll get there, but being in the army. And what about high school? How did lessons about what Israel is, who the Jews are, did Palestinians appear in the curriculum in any form? A history of Palestine?
No, I mean the word. Of course, there's there's Israel, right? I mean, if and this is I remember from I don't know conversations around me, but again, very little, right? That if we can, what happened in the 1948 war, right? This typical Israeli narrative at the time, right? The Palestinians fled, right? Because their leaders told them to leave, right? But again, there's no, there's no very, very little in even in high school. But also, I went to a science technology high school, so maybe related to that as well. But I mean, my father at the time really wished that I would become an engineer like him. So of course I became a historian, but very little of any significant history of the place and certainly of Palestinians.
Yeah, and I think for you, we've talked in the past about formal education. Schooling for you was almost non-existent. You said sorry to your high school self, but you skipped class a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You spent most of your day playing soccer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't. I wasn't. I was very insecure.
Yeah.
I was a very insecure teenager.
That's supposed to be unique to American Jews. We're supposed to have the
Unique to Israeli Jews.
insecurities our thing.
Yeah, I was very insecure, and like I think, but again, I think this is a lot of teenagers, feel insecure in various ways. I think I was feeling, very significantly insecure, and one of the ways to deal with it is to, like, be less in school, I
Yeah.
guess, for me. So yeah, I did skip school, high school, a lot. Yeah, but again, this I think that the key really is this sense of disavow, right? Or not the sense, the mechanism of disavow, right? Because when you deny, right, denial requires recognition, actually, right? So
Yeah.
this is kind of the. So if you don't have to deny, it's great. You can just push something to the status of complete insignificance, right? And that's really how we remember it, right? Even there's very little that I remember in any significant way about studying, say, about Israeli wars, right? Where they're supposed to be like a thing in Israeli national identity, right? But nothing like really historically significant, right, about these wars that I remember learning in school.
That's interesting. So there were no real moments where you even saw the curriculum become visible for you. The path was laid out, and it was just one on which you traveled.
Yeah, it was just feeling. It was feeling Israeli in a straightforward way. Where you don't have to think about it; you just have to feel it, right? And it's meant to create and enhance and maintain and reproduce this sense of belonging, right? Belonging to place, security, right? All these things, and of course, when you think about it, of course, right? My mother was born in Bulgaria. My father was born in Romania. Right? So a lot of the vast majority of people around me, right, had like immediate family ties and memory, indeed, right, to
Mhm.
many other places, right, but the belonging to that place seemed like straightforward, required no elaboration whatsoever, right? So it was, in that sense, really this kind of, actually, I have to say, what is. So it was not even the Holocaust redemption narrative, really. It was much more what's today like the religious Zionist narrative of this like immediate connection to the land from antiquity, right? So we
Yeah.
jump over all of history and we're here again. We've always been here. We belong here, unproblematically, right? And it just gives. The thing is that it gives you a good feeling, right?
Yeah. There's this championing of a kind of a indigeneity that has been
Yeah.
thoroughly successful in the Zionist narrative here.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like you're saying that essentially this was something that was always going to be for you, that you followed through. And so after high school, did that immediately lead to joining the IOF, IDF?
No, I went to the university first. There's this kind of program that you can also study for a degree and then go to the army. So I did that, and then I went to the army. And towards the end of my service, I had to leave, right? Because I wanted to travel a bit. I was still in the army, and that was my first trip actually to India. And I mentioned this, right, because I think that one of the things that happened to me in the army is something that happens to a lot of people in armies, regardless of ideological views, or is that they experience something related to an oppressive system, and also really an organization that its role is violence, right? This way or the other, right? Again, I was still very firmly situated within a very kind of, again, straightforward Israeli framework, right? But I was, realizing that the army was having a very negative impact on me, just on an individual basis, right? And I think again, it's not at all unique. Of course, everyone goes to the army in Israel. It's mandatory, right? And it's indeed part of the identity, right? The Israeli identity. Anyway, because I went to university before, then I was in this program where you train as an officer, and therefore I served for more than 33 years. And in my fourth year, I was supposed to serve more, but in my fourth year, because of how I felt in the army, I asked and I got leave, right? And that was my first trip to India. And I mentioned this because, as you said at the introduction, that's where I actually became really interested in issues of genocide. What I mean really, again, I had this kind of, growing up in Israel and with the family background, I had this kind of interest in the Holocaust, but without knowing anything, right?
Yeah.
And without knowing also anything about Jewish history, anything like that. But in India, I was in the southern Rajasthan city of Udaipur, and I stumbled into a bookstore, and I encountered a booklet with the essay of Arundhati Roy at the time, The Greater Common Good, right, which was about mega dam construction and its destructive impact on indigenous people and indigenous lands. At the time, of course, I knew nothing about any of this, and I remember just sitting in the bookstore and reading the whole essay. It's not that long of an essay, and I was, intrigued. I was, it sparked my curiosity. And I mention this because I think that in this trip, one of the main experiences that I had, actually, that's very relevant to our discussion here, is that I learned so much, right?
Yeah.
And I realized how little I actually know, right? And I think that, and again, it was very firmly established within the Israeli framework, right? But it was a eye-opening experience for me, I think, certainly looking back, in the sense that I understood that, that I actually don't know anything about the world around me, right? Yeah. So that was kind of a very destabilizing, in a productive way, a destabilizing experience.
And that's really interesting. I was just actually in a study group last night, and we were reading a little Edward Said, and he was talking about how Israel itself presented as this Enlightenment project, right? This idea of a civilizing force to the land, an enlightened Western people, and yet also an indigenous group of people, as they sold themselves as. And yet you're saying that it seemed like this belonging and this feeling of place was actually very narrow. And it took leaving Israel, this purported beacon of democracy and enlightenment and modernity, to actually encounter something outside of that. And it was not so much directly looking into Palestinian history, but actually, Roy is certainly a decolonial writer,
Absolutely.
Thinker, essayist.
I'd never heard about her before I went into that bookstore, I have to say, right? It was
that is a serendipitous moment. So this would be, I guess maybe let's take a step back first. So why India? It sounds like there is some frustration, some kind of things were bubbling up, but maybe not a questioning of Israel, just a questioning of your job, a questioning of your place. And
well, it was related to the army, and the army is very central, as I said, in Israeli identity. Why India? Complete chance, actually. My partner at the time and I she was already in India, and my desire was to actually meet her there and continue to New Zealand.
Okay.
That never happened. I landed in New Delhi, and I felt interestingly under attack, right? So from the sights, the smells, the everything, it was complete. Never been in India before. And as I said, I just learned so much, right? This moment in the bookstore is significant because I think that what happened to me in the bookstore is I don't know if you know this essay by Arundhati Roy, The Greater Common Good, but it's a very, very strong essay on total destruction, basically, right? I think I sat there again, in the way that I kind of look back on it now, and it started to dawn on me that the way that I'm thinking about the Holocaust, this kind of challenged it, right? Because she actually, there's like sentences there in the way that Arundhati Roy writes, right? Say just about the number of victims of mega dam construction, even just in India, right, which is in the tens of millions, perhaps, right, according to what she wrote there. And and I, this is completely new to me, but it also is very, very kind of destabilizing, right? To think about levels of destruction like this, right? That obviously, at least require that I engage with this somewhat, even with just a very, very, very superficial ideas. I wouldn't even say knowledge, actually, ideas that I had about the Holocaust, right? So I think that I just learned so much, and I think that the key issue that I learned, and I think is very significant in learning, is that how much I don't know, right? And I think this is what really, this was like I don't think that I realized it, but it was really the kind of very foundational in really starting to be curious about not India, but about Israel, right? But still, it was, I was still not there, right? In that moment.
Yeah. So this is the moment that we're trying to get to in this podcast, when a world has been so thoroughly made for you that you're not even questioning it. You're not even aware of it. And then with Roy's essay, that world came crashing down. But you didn't have a vocabulary. You hadn't studied in formal spaces or anything. You didn't know the word Nakba.
No.
Or you knew the word possibly, but you didn't know the event and the history.
Not sure yet, actually, at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but all of a sudden things are cracking and this world is becoming unmade. What did you do next? Where did this lead you?
Well, it still took a long time, right? I mean, so I came back. Eventually, I left the army a bit earlier because I had to serve actually a couple more years because of that program. But you might say that we had this kind of very unpleasant divorce.
You and the IDF were not getting along anymore.
No, not at all, not at all. But which again, I think that it was a very individual experience, but it was like this experience that's related to a key Israeli institute, right? The army that really stands at the center of the Israeli identity. And then, I mean, I came back, I left the army, and then we went again to India. But I remember that traveling, I was thinking about this kind of, what do I want to do, in my life, right? Or like, it was like, do we want to go back to Israel and do something? Or shall we go to Tokyo, work for 6 months, and come back to travel, right? This was the kind of options that people were talking about at the time. Anyway, eventually we decided that we want to study. My partner at the time wanted to study art, and I had decided that maybe I'll pursue this kind of very superficial ideas that I had about the Holocaust, and I'll go study the Holocaust, right? And what that meant is, for me at the time, was going to get a master's in Jewish history, right? So I went back to Israel. I applied and went to study Jewish history in Tel Aviv University. And it's interesting because, I was still very, very firmly situated within what I'll just call here, right, the Israeli framework, okay? Which means that when I went to pursue this intellectual endeavor of studying Jewish history and the Holocaust, what that meant for me was to confirm the ideas that I had, even at that point, right, when there was also already a crack, as you said, right? So what that meant was to confirm that the Holocaust was unique, right? Yeah. To confirm that anti-Semitism is a unique driving force, right? and that everyone had always hated us and everyone will always hate us, right? Um, and therefore, I'm not surprised that I also then sought out. I was actually a student of, a very important figure in Holocaust scholarship around the world, but also in Israel, Yehuda Bauer, right? He came to teach a special. He was already retired actually at the time. He came to teach a special seminar in Tel Aviv University, and I went, and I really wanted to work with him. So I remember trying to impress him in the seminar, and it probably worked because he became my master's advisor, right? So why am I mentioning this? I mean, he also continued to serve on my doctoral dissertation committee later on, but already that's a different stage. There was a clear deterioration in our relationship already there, but afterwards it led to a complete break. But that's later. But I mentioned this because at the time, Yehuda Bauer is one of the, is a founding figure of what's called the Jerusalem School of Jewish History and Holocaust Studies, which is a very Zionist nationalist, right, school of thought in this field. Where indeed the Holocaust is unique and Jews are unique and anti-Semitism is very important, right, as a kind of straightforward analytical or like quasi-analytical framework and so on and so forth. And that's what I wanted to do, right? And in a way, that's what I did in my master's, right? And I remember that after my master's, basically, I went on to a PhD, and I was in the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, at a completely different stage. But I remember that moving to that stage, by the way, like kind of the trip to India, was mostly motivated by the fact that we wanted to leave Israel at the time. Not because of any kind of, we felt strongly, not at all. We were just like, where do we go from here? Kind of, again, very privileged individual perspective in the sense that we can, right, choose where to go and this kind of thing. But even after India and this crack, right, I was still very much in the framework that now my next stage in learning, right, was to confirm my feeling, right? And that's really what I did in my master's. If you're really looking for a place where things started to change significantly, right? It's really in those years that we moved to pursue my doctoral degree and my partner at the time, her master's degree. And only then, so this is 2006, 2007, right? Really started to read about the history of Israel, right? And together with this, and this was already while visiting in the summers in Israel back, right? We were then living in the Boston area. So I started reading, I started understanding there's some key problems, things that I don't know. And, I started learning about the Nakba, right? And some of it involved a lot of rejection initially, right? So I read, I rejected, kind of argued with myself, then read more, right? This kind of thing. But it was also combined with, for example, going to the demonstrations in Sheikh Jarrah, so the Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem, that at the time, 2008, 2009, was when the intensification of the state-sponsored and settler attempts to displace Palestinians from the neighborhood to take over their houses. It's when a movement emerged in Israel that part of what they did was these kind of weekly demonstrations. And over the summer, when we visited, I went to these demonstrations as well. So there was also this. But it was a long process, right? That really started very late when you think about it. Again, 2006, maybe a year before or something like this. But, as I was finishing my master's and starting my PhD.
Yeah. So what was your master's about? What was your thesis?
So this is my Jerusalem school phase,
please.
right?
Yeah.
So in that, Yehuda Bauer at the time was working on what became the book that he was writing then. It was called Death of the Shtetl. And it was about these shtetl, in Eastern Europe and how they were destroyed during the Holocaust. Basically, that was the book. all within the Jerusalem School framework, right? It was very Yehuda Bauer. And so I thought at the time, I was very inspired by that. And I said, okay, maybe I'll write about a small shtetl. I remember that, that I got the attention of Bauer, and, we were sitting one day, and he said, so what do you want to write in this seminar about, right, the paper, right? And I said, maybe a little, a small shtetl in Eastern Europe, right? And at the time, there was a book that came out, actually by Ilana Rosen. She's a literary scholar at Ben-Gurion University at the time. She was, and she wrote a book about the testimonies of Jews from the Carpathian region.
Oh.
And
which we'll see later as a question you've continued, right?
Right. But I this was the first time that I heard about the Carpathian region. I actually had to look at a map for quite a long time to understand where that was, right? And so Bauer, who was very amused of my idea, said, well, where, Eastern Europe, that's, where. And that week I just, I saw that book, and I, flipped through it, and I said, maybe the Carpathian region, right? I think he actually burst out laughing, right?
Okay.
And but eventually he said, okay, you know what? There's a small town there. It's called Chust, right? Go to Yad Vashem and see what testimonies, right? Because he said, he actually laughed at me, and he said, like all Israelis, you don't speak in languages, right? Right. So it's actually interesting. But so we go to Yad Vashem and see what testimonies you found there. And I actually found like about 35 testimonies of survivors from Chust in Yad Vashem. And I wrote a seminar paper about it, right? Which was pretty terrible, but not that terrible that, so that I think Bauer saw some potential there somehow, right? Yeah. And that then developed into a master's thesis on the central Jewish center in the Carpathian region, on the town of Mukachevo. And again, it's still very much in the Jerusalem School frame, right? It's very there's basically almost only Jews, right, in the story, yep. Right? There's no one else, certainly no one else who is significant, right? And it's also structured, right, according, there's a bit before, there's mostly the Holocaust, there's a little bit after, right? But it was very Jerusalem School framework, right, in the sense that it really it was basically telling another story about the Holocaust that is unique, right, and about the destruction of Jews that is unique, right. Then I reworked it a bit, and it came out as a small book in Yad Vashem, and published by Yad Vashem.
That's interesting. So, yeah, essentially, your task as a scholar was to pursue knowledge, but that knowledge was within the small little bubble of constantly asserting, there are new angles and new ways of expressing our uniqueness and the history that we've encountered. And so that led to, I want to learn more and say more of that. So you went to a doctorate.
Yeah, well, I went to, I remember that, so again, at the time, as I said, towards the end of my master's, I already started to read. Just, so, I said, okay, I don't remember exactly what was the trigger of that, right? If there was conversations, or I don't remember exactly, but I remember that I felt that I need to learn about the history of the place, right? And together with that, there was this idea of what do we do now, right? Mm-hmm. And a sense it wasn't based on any kind of, I don't want to be here, that is there in Israel, right, or anything like that. It was just that maybe it would be good to do a doctoral degree somewhere else, right? Yeah. And actually, Bauer was very much against it, right? He said, he really articulated this very Israeli framework of, why do you need to go anywhere else, right? The work that you need to do is here. It's only here that you can contribute in any meaningful way, right? It's kind of like, the going don't matter, right?
Sounds like a bubby.
Yeah.
What do you need to go down there?
Yeah.
So expensive. Just stay here.
Yeah, it was also very expensive to migrate. Luck, I had a nice fellowship for my doctoral degree, but one that just kept us right just a bit above poverty, really. Yeah. But then I also got a Fulbright fellowship, which was terrific, which was so. But it was also this idea of how would we manage, right? Yeah. And it was very difficult, actually. But then eventually he said, okay, we'll go. I applied. My partner at the time applied. We got in, and 2007 we went to India for the summer and then flew to Boston.
and so then this 2006, 2007 starts this a bit back and forth process of a bit of critique and then reforming Israel, critique Israel, and back and forth. What were things engaged in that conversation? Were there materials, teachers, lessons that were challenging your worldview?
So think about it, that you grow up, and again, it's not like this outright denial, right? But it's this kind of disavowal, and suddenly it's like you open the door to a room and you turn on the light, right? And you say, "Oh my God!" You close the light, right?
This is very, very, very platonic of you.
Right.
You come out of the cave and you're like, I need some more time in my Tel Aviv world.
So you close the light and you said, but shit, I've already seen something there, right? I mean, there's so you turn on the light again, you turn it off, you start touching some things, right? Something drops to the floor, breaks, there's things start. So I don't remember everything, but I remember the process, right? That it took a long time. It involved also rejection, right? It also involved this is the time when actually the Hamas takeover in Gaza, right? And then the start of the repeated Israeli attacks on Gaza. And I remember that and as that began, right, I thought that it was fine, right? So it was there was
even while you're going to Sheikh Jarrah, you're like, oh no, these attacks are justified, necessary.
Again, and I don't remember exactly how I articulated this to myself. It's a long time ago, but
no, it's not.
What?
No, it's not.
But I remember that, and again, think about it also that this Zionist project of fracturing Palestinian society, right? So it's not that strange that people can think about East Jerusalem in one way, about the occupied West Bank in another way, about Israeli Palestinians in a third way, and about Gaza in a fourth way, right? Not to mention Palestinians around the world, right? Refugees. So I'm saying this just to convey that the process was very complex, right?
Yeah.
But I think that the key also is then how I was also beginning my doctoral studies, right? And I was incredibly fortunate to work with Professor Deborah at work, and we're very close today as well. And I was very fortunate because I think that Deborah understood from the beginning that I'm in this process of change in various ways, right? And I came into the doctoral program, I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do, right? Which is Holocaust, Jews, and there's nothing else that's really, what else could be important, right? In this world, right? I also still came with a very kind of Israeli, the approach of an Israeli man. That means that I know everything, right? And Deborah was not having any of that, of course, right? But she is, she is a true teacher and advisor at heart. And she really, really helped me, guided me, right, in this process of change. And I mention this because I think that some of what happened in relation to my learning process on Israel and Palestine was related to my doctoral work, because what happened in my doctoral work was that eventually I wrote a dissertation that challenges in fundamental way, right, the idea that the Holocaust is unique and that anti-Semitism is a straightforward explanation through this regional case study of the Carpathian region in a completely different way than I had imagined when I came in, of course. Completely different. You can't think about, more opposite, right, the idea that I had coming in and what eventually I wrote, right? And I think that it's related because, as I said, the ideas that I had, the feelings that I had about Israel growing up, right, in Israel, were also based in some way on the idea that the Holocaust is unique, that Israel is unique, that Jews are unique, right? And as I said, these ideas about anti-Semitism. And as I was doing my doctoral studies, right, all this changed in my mind, and through my work very, very clearly, right? So I think it had, an impact on what I was thinking about Israel and Palestine at the time.
Yeah. But it's interesting that it wasn't abandonment. It was kind of a complete remaking of the same place and asking, as you said, a fundamentally different question.
Well, the thing, so you're talking about Israel.
I'm talking about Israel, but also even your focus on the Carpathians. But
oh yeah, look, even when I went to do my archival work in archives that are today in Western Ukraine, so the Carpathian region is today in Western Ukraine, and this is 2010 and 11 a bit, and I was still thinking that I would have this kind of Jerusalem school style focus on Jews. So when I went to the archives, and it took me a long time to enter these archives, it's a different story, but eventually I remember that I was looking only for material about Jews. And it took me, and again, I'm not, as I say, I'm not a genius, but I'm not stupid. It took me a long time to realize that the Hungarian authorities that were the occupying force in the region during the war very rarely talked only about Jews. Right? So it started, it started to become clear to me that if I wanted to know about Jews, actually, I have to, start looking at the archive actually in a completely different way, and that actually also meant that I have to look also at the testimonies of Jews, for example, in a completely different way, right? Yeah. Now, again, this is a very long process of change, right? So we're talking about something that really, it starts maybe in that first trip in India, which is like 25 years ago, right? Yeah. And it continues very, very, very slowly. There's another stage there, 2005, 2006, right? And then it continues through my doctoral studies. But one of the key things that I wanted to say here is that it takes even longer, right, to really understand fully, right, something that is just a fact. And if you read Zionist texts, right, that Israel is a settler colonial project. Now, if you look at, On the Iron Wall, Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky, right, 1923, right, it's a text that admits the settler colonial character of the Zionist project outright, right, without any problem, right? And if you read Anita Shapira, one of the most important Zionist historians, right, her book from about 25 years ago, Land and Power, I think, she talks about Zionism as a settler colonial project as well, right? It's a very important Zionist historian. But it took me a long time to get to that point, right? And it's a very important point that Israel is a settler colonial project because, the process for me was really, it took a very long time until I really understood that I actually grew up in a lie. Right, and I say this because for me it was shattering. Shattering, is that the right?
It's shattering of yourself.
It shattered how it was the last phase of really, I would say, dismantling this sense of belonging that I articulated at the beginning. Right, this unproblematic, straightforward, deep sense of belonging to the place, right? Which was very comfortable, right? Which was very cozy, to really. Yeah. The world was simple, right? And I have to say that I've lost any sense of belonging at this point in my life, right? I mean, I live in Philadelphia. I've lived in Philadelphia since 2006. I don't consider it home, right? I don't feel at home in Philadelphia. Actually, the place where I least feel at home now is Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
Right? And so it took, and I think that again, the issue of looking at the connection between my academic work and this process is very important, right? Because it tells us something about how ideas about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, right, structure in a kind of unproblematic way, but without knowing anything really, right? As I said, these kinds of feelings, right? And of course, they're also they've always been very explicitly weaponized in Israeli politics and society, right? Well, before 7th of October. And I think that the more I delved into these issues, and after I finished my doctoral studies, even more, right? And, at that point, I had already read a lot, and, I've also started to engaging in, more, say academically, perhaps, with the history of Israel and Palestine. When really this realization, right, that there is actually a process of genocidal violence, actually, right? Genocidal, I'm talking here colloquially, right, in that sense, not the any kind of definition of genocide, but there's a process of destructive violence involved in the founding and the establishing of Israel, right? Which then, of course, it destabilized, it shattered, right, the sense of belonging that I had, right, but also, the sense of identity that I said that Jews and Israel are actually the same thing. Of course, throughout my studies, there was also this another process, right, of understanding actually Jewish life and culture well before Israel, right, in a much more complex way. So this was, another very important, meaningful learning process. But this really brought me to, in the last few years, right, this realization basically that I grew up in a lie. That was never. It was not. It was not a straightforward. It was not like an explicit lie, right? No one, as I said, denied anything, or it was just made up of these mechanisms of disavowal, right? Mm-hmm. And this actually goes back in a kind of, for me, to one of the key issues when you think about Holocaust scholarship and the lessons of the Holocaust, perhaps, quote unquote, if you want to use this formulation, which is the significance of the truth, right? Of insisting on historical truth, right? Insisting on documented, right, truth. And this is where I started to also realize much more explicit, obviously, which also explicit mechanisms of denial, which also became much more common in Israel, I think, in the last 10, 15 years, right? Of actually denial, just documented truth. And I saw this in family frameworks and social frameworks, in various interactions, which, of course, even more, I would say, exacerbated what was really a crisis for me, right? Yeah. An identity crisis, in that sense, you could say, right? Which is ongoing in that sense, right? And I wish that I could, I'm just saying this because to emphasize the strength of the Israeli identity, right? I wish that I really could feel like, I would even say just comfortable, say, right, in kind of a Jewish identity, right? But I don't, right? Yeah. I haven't found it, that is, right, yet.
So I think we're probably going to be in a bit of a stuck place because there's a discomfort there. There's something unresolved there. But before I start thinking about what you did with this breaking, this unmaking of the self, and I also think there's something, the exact opposite of disavowal. That kind of truth-telling is an act of avowal. But I want to linger a little bit more, just maybe one more question on this idea of the world being unmade. So you're talking about formal teachers, this very well-known scholar, these texts that you're encountering and now reading critically. But you're also talking about going to East Jerusalem. You're talking about participating in new ways. Are you meeting people during these times? Are you encountering folks who maybe were not visible to you, had been invisibilized?
No, absolutely. It was also the time when I got to know Professor Amos Goldberg, who's a very important Holocaust scholar and a scholar of the Jewish world at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was also very active in the Sheikh Jarrah movement and in other activism until today. He's very active. So yes, there's discussions, there's interactions with other people. I remember, the people from Tel Aviv coming to the demonstrations there was a bus that took us from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So discussions on the bus, right? In the demonstration, of course, discussions with people like Amos. Then on the other, side of the pond, right? Ongoing discussions with my advisor there, Deborah. And I was still very much in touch with Yehuda Bauer, right? Every time I visited him as well. There was this. That's why I'm saying that it's a very long process, and I think that yes, there was a lot of also learning. There was reading and much more actually reading of Palestinian scholars, right?
And that's what I'm wondering. When do you start engaging with Palestinian scholars, with Palestinian activists, and
so there's some of that, but that comes even later, for various reasons. But and one of the important encounters I think I had with Palestinian scholars with Professor Nadira Shalab-Kevorkian at the Hebrew University. Also, she's a Palestinian scholar who works a lot on the Israeli settler colonial assault on children and youth, on Palestinian children and youth, on East Jerusalem. Her book on this, what she calls unchilding, actually, from a few years ago, very, very important. But I remember, again, so it was after I finished my doctoral studies, I had a postdoc at the Hebrew University. That's when I got to know Nadira Shalab-Kevorkian. And I remember that I started reading her work, and this is where, Nadira Shalab-Kevorkian, all her work is in the frame of Israeli settler colonial genocide, really. That's how she calls it. That's how she's always described it, right? And this is where, I started to this is where this process of this very, I would say, intense, challenging of my sense of belonging came, especially because, as I said, so I started, and there are many other Palestinian scholars that I was, starting to engage with and read at the time, because it's very important scholarship. It's very well based, right? A lot of it is actually based on testimonies of Palestinians, right? I pay a lot of attention to the voices and the perspectives and the knowledge of Holocaust survivors, and I work with testimonies, right? So if you do that, it means, right, again, especially as my professional perspective kind of broadened, right, beyond the Jerusalem School framework with which I started, then the voices of people who face state violence, right, matter, right? But the more I engaged with that, the more I understood that the implications, right, for how I feel about the place, right, are what you might call disastrous, right? So yes, there was engagement with people, with scholarship, right, and also with Palestinian scholars. But again, this kind of phase of the engagement, you can really say from the end kind of my doctoral studies, so 2013, 12, 13, right, and onwards. So this is kind of the last decade or so.
Yeah. And so I think that leads perfectly into this question of, the third part that we're looking for. The world that was made being the first part, the world that was unmade, and now the third part being the future that you're looking to build. So you've engaged with this a little bit, but what did you do with this this truth that you now had, this really uncomfortable feeling of, this is a lie. Everything that I know and I have learned my very sense of belonging is a lie. Where did that lead you?
Well, it has, on the way that I feel individually, that hasn't changed, right? I mean, in the sense that, as I said, I've lost that sense of very deep and strong belonging, right, to the place, Israel, that I had. That's gone, and obviously, there's no way that it will come back, right? Because it was indeed based on a lie, right? Um, I haven't managed to develop, right, this sort of sense of belonging anywhere else, and maybe that's because I'm not thinking imaginatively about belonging, right, or identities or these kinds of things, right. But what it has led me is to, well, it led me to a number of things. First of all, I continued my intellectual work as a scholar of the Holocaust and genocide, and on the Jewish world, for example, on issues of anti-Semitism, today on the weaponization of the discourse around anti-Semitism, primarily led by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, actually, and these kinds of things. But in the sense that today, I think it's very important to stress again and again, right, that Jews in Israel, which, as I said, when I grew up in Israel, it was one of the same, right? There weren't it really shows you how this kind of idea of second-class citizenship status of Arab citizens, Palestinian citizens in Israel was kind of conceived, right? Because you don't, right, as a Jew growing up, you don't even consider Jews in Israel are the same. Anyone who's not a Jew, what does that mean, right? I mean, in Israel, right?
Yeah.
But today, I think that it's very important because of the strength of this Israeli discourse and the way that, when you think about American Jews, for example, how the identity is still of many American Jews, even who are very critical towards Israel, is still very much based, right, on the Holocaust and on Israel, right? Mm-hmm. And so this kind of conflation, basically, of a people and a state, right? So that's part of the work that I do, but also part of the work that I do on myself, right? Again, unsuccessfully so far, or maybe I'm just in the process, right? That even thinking about, am I Israeli, right? Because sometimes when I talk somewhere in some place, I'm introduced as an Israeli historian, right? So what am I? I still have an Israeli passport, which I'm actually thinking of giving up, and I just acquired an American citizenship. And
I wasn't going to say anything.
And I also have a Bulgarian citizenship, actually, through my mother. So thinking again, both intellectually, right, through my work about people and a state, in this sense, Jews in Israel, but also about, how shall I put it, my place in the world, as it were, perhaps. But it also really, in the last few years, in a more pronounced way, I think, as Israeli mass violence against Palestinians, I think escalated in very many ways, even more, right, in the last few years, well before 7th of October, right. It has led me even more to, in this kind of, I think, sense of urgency to insist on the truth, right? Yeah. And especially as a Jew, as an Israeli, perhaps a former Israeli, whatever, right? To speak out and to think about and sometimes work on, also teach in some cases, issues and questions related to Israel and Palestine. So again, I think that, when I say insist on the truth, it's also very important because in the background there's constantly this realization that I grew up in a lie. And for a long time, right, think about the process that I outlined, right? It took me a long time, right, to kind of emerge from this lie. And that's also one of the things that, my family in that sense is representative, I think, of, more broadly Israeli society, that the way in which they continue to dwell basically in the denial and the rejection of documented truth, right, is something that, just drives me absolutely crazy, right?
Yeah. And I think that's such an important point. The idea of it. It's not just that it took you a long time. I'm going to be a bit cheesy here, but it took a lot of strength and reflection and inquiry and study to get to this place of critique. And I think, to use what you were referring to before, there's a difference between knowing a truth and, turning that light on, and, to put it in educational terms, studying and teaching and learning towards a world in which that truth is seen and practiced. And I think maybe this is a point where I want to turn to. I have one thing written down here. So in the question of building other worlds, I think your work is very important right now. The first week after October 7th, you published a piece in Jewish Currents called A Textbook Case of Genocide. Your writing is, of course, deeply critical of the state of Israel. And to quote one of your pieces in The Guardian, you say, quote, "This provides some hope in these dark days as it supports the struggle for a different future beyond the Israeli state, a future that should be based on equality, justice, freedom, and dignity for all the people who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea." So I think the clear call for a ceasefire is there. The message of a different world is there. But what are you hoping to teach here? What are you specifically hoping to work towards through educational work?
The key is to, as I said before, for me, and for me, really, in this sense, as a Jew and as a scholar of the Jewish world and of the Holocaust, right? The key is to forefront the perspectives and the knowledge and the voices of those who face state violence and those who face mass violence, as well as the documented truth of the genocidal character of Israel's assault on Gaza after 7th of October. But if you think about disavowal, right, the mechanism of disavowal, of creating this feeling of Israeliness, if you like, right, growing up, and all the way to actually more explicit forms of denial, right, like the Nakba law in Israel, for example, right, or various forms of Nakba denial, or these kinds of thing, they are really based on denial of the perspectives, the voices, the knowledge of Palestinians, the denial actually of Palestinians as a people, right? And this is itself based on really, what Israel was since its founding, right, based on a Jewish supremacist framework, right, as a political project. So if you ask me what I want to teach, or to convey, right, or what I think is important, in the things that I write and say now, is twofold. One is indeed to forefront, to put at the center, right, the experiences of Palestinians, right, their histories, their understandings, their knowledge, right, and then we can think, indeed, not just, we can all see, right, the unprecedented levels of destruction and killing in Gaza, right, but there's so much else that is going on in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. In Israel, there's almost 2 million Israeli Palestinians, right? So to forefront their histories, their voices about what's going on right now, to undermine, there's what we can now see very clearly, if indeed we recognize what I think is very well documented, the genocidal character of Israel's attack on Gaza, is that the creation of Israel, right, was, and then it took me a long time to come to this realization, right? But the creation of Israel is very paradoxical in the sense that Israel reproduced systems and structures of violence that had targeted Jews for exclusion and eventually destruction in Europe. So one is the nation-state system, right, the exclusionary nation-state system, and the other is, of course, the settler colonial white supremacy structure, which manifested itself in Israel as Jewish supremacy. right? And if we forefront the perspectives and voices of Palestinians thinking about this, right, then then we have the potential, right, to undermine this system, perhaps, right? This is ideally, right, and to really, in the quote that you read from what I wrote in the Guardian, to think about a completely different kind of political arrangement, right, in that land that's not based on Jewish supremacy, right? That's not based on the denial of a people and the denial of their history, right? And the continued assault on them, right? But it's actually based on truth, on coming to terms, on learning this history, right? On placing it actually at the center and thinking of in various ways, right, to move beyond Jewish supremacy, beyond violence, beyond genocide, beyond exclusion, beyond denial of a people, and that would indeed be based on ideas about equality, about how we can think about very loaded terms like reparations, right? What kind of political structures to build there, indeed how to think about the belonging of people to the place now after decades of violence and occupation and siege. But I think that these are all very loaded questions, as I say, right, and very complex issues. But what do I want to teach? I want to teach that, right, that we can't continue basically living in a lie that's foundational to Israel and foundational to the Israeli identity, right? We have to somehow emerge from it.
Yeah, and I think that becomes a tricky point because, I went through a long unlearning process myself, and you have highlighted throughout our talk how much this took of you and how much it took out of you. But when we're in the middle of a genocide, I don't think Palestinians can wait around for us to go on long educational journeys. So I wonder what we do with that in this very urgent, immediate work. And I wonder where study and learning can come in there and in unmaking these worlds with a sense of urgency. And
I agree. I mean, there's a sense of urgency now that we can't wait for people to go through processes of change. And and if for me this process took such a long time, I mean, you can imagine that obviously, yes, we're in a very critical moment here. But I think that yes, when I say what I want to teach is to forefront, as I said, the voices and perspectives, the histories, the experiences of Palestinians, to undermine Jewish supremacy. I'm not actually here aiming at Jewish Israelis, right, at all anymore. Yeah. As you said, this is unbelievably urgent. I think that we can see in various ways that the exceptional status that was attached to Israel from the beginning as an issue of identity in the West, right? Again, post-Holocaust, related to, in any case, the place of Jews in the Judeo-Christian world. But the fact that now Israel, as the highest court in the UN, right, the International Court of Justice has ruled, is plausibly perpetrating genocide in Gaza, that has created a lot of cracks in how people, including people in positions of power around the world, right, see Israel and think about Israel and imagine how to continue or not to continue to engage with Israel moving forward, and what should happen in Israel and Palestine moving forward. So I'm talking to these people, actually, right? Of course, I'm also talking to students and, absolutely. But I think that now there is a point where we need to push forward to widen these cracks, right, significantly. And that's a key part of what I'm doing these days, right? So to basically to tell people we cannot continue. I mean, Israel has enjoyed impunity, right? Even though there's mountains of, again, documented evidence, right, of Israeli violations of international law and the occupation, the settlement project, right? So many forms of mass violence. As I said, Nader Eshel Kevorkian has documented the Israeli attack against Palestinian children and youth, and so on and so forth, right? There was impunity for that for various reasons, right? Now this is cracking, right? We need to widen these cracks, right? So a significant part of what I do now, what I want to teach is looking at, for example, the 800 serving officials in the U.S. and UK government who earlier this month signed a letter that they now believe that it's likely that their governments, right, are actually complicit in a likely genocide, right, in Gaza. So this is 800 serving officials, right? And there's other, there's many things happening now around the world as a result of this, right? So this is what I mean now primarily when I think about teaching, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So do you think that there's any role, of course, your lesson of at this moment and always in this work centering Palestinian voices. But I'm wondering back to where we started, this feeling of a 10, 11-year-old Raz kind of messing around in fifth grade, talking about the first intifada at the playground. Is there any speaking to that person? Is there any way of challenging the curricular world that was made for you? Or do you think that that kind of work needs to wait or be bundled up in a much larger project of building an entirely different political formation?
Yeah, I think it's something that cannot happen at this moment, actually, and for the vast majority of Jews in Israel. And indeed, it needs to wait until significant change, I hope, right, that will have to come from outside pressure and from the significant change that we're already seeing, right, in the approach to Israel in various ways. You can think about, from this letter of, hundreds of serving officials in the U.S. and U.K. government. You can think about, again, this month as well. This is all in relation to the ICJ ruling about the plausible genocide in Israel's attack on Gaza. There's a huge Japanese company, for example, Itochu, that decided to cut all its ties with the giant Israeli arms and surveillance technology manufacturer, Elbit Systems. You can think about the way in which there's some governments, like in Belgium, for example, who are starting to consider in practical ways, right, whether they agree or not, right, to transfer arms to Israel, right. You can think about other initiatives that will, I hope, force a change, right. First of all, force a stop to Israel's attack on Gaza, right, and stop this genocidal attack. But as you said, lay the ground at least for a completely different political reality that then within that we can think about another education, perhaps, right, another world. But that's at this point with the unfolding destruction, with the Israeli attack on Rafah. Now, I mean, the level of urgency of all this now means that there is no talking to 10, 11-year-old, Raz Segal somewhere in a playground in Israel.
Yeah. I would like to think that forms of education are still possible. Maybe not in that way, but I think the last question I'll ask is, of course, right now the urgency means get out in the street, sign petitions, participate in a number of ways, and certainly listening as organizations like the Palestine Coalition take the lead. But I'm also wondering where, if anybody's questioning, if anybody's starting to take action, where you suggest they study, what educational events in which they might be interested in participating. Where do you suggest people go to learn, to study, to inquire about how to act in solidarity and build these other worlds?
I mean, again, I mean, it's, for me, it's now very clear that if people want to learn, right, significantly about what's going on, but also about the broad, because we can't really understand Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza without understanding Israeli history, right, from the beginning, from the Nakba, and actually from before it, right, because the Zionist settler project started before 1948. So if we want to really understand this history, if we want to learn about it, if we want to ask critical questions about it, then there is now so many events and panels with Palestinian scholars and with Palestinian artists and with Palestinian educators. There are so many opportunities, right, online, in person. That's where I would recommend that people go. Yes, go and sit and be very uncomfortable, right, with hearing about the fact that Palestinians understand the Nakba in 1948 as genocide. Indeed, a lot of Palestinians today say, I grew up listening to the stories of my grandparents about the Nakba, right, but I never really understood, right, what they were telling me. Now, right, when we're all witnessing the unfolding genocidal assault on Gaza, they say, now we understand. So that actually sheds new light on what the Nakba actually was, right? And again, this has actually, also broader potential, right, for the learning of people about the world around them. Because around the world today, we have more than 100 million forcibly displaced people, right? 100 million, right? So there's actually a clear problem with the nation state system, with kind of the hegemonic political system in our world, right? If we forefront the voices of Palestine, if we take, as many people in the global south do, if we take Gaza, right, if we center Gaza also as a way to really struggle against an hegemonic political system in the West that has abandoned dozens and dozens of millions of people, then this arguably has implications beyond Gaza, beyond Israel and Palestine. It has implications maybe of rethinking, U.S. past and present, right? Our society, right? So you want to, yes, go listen to Palestinians, go engage with their experiences, with their knowledge, with their teaching, right? That's what I would recommend for people to do. And that, hopefully, because of the urgency of the moment and because it's so in our face, right? Maybe that will also drive people in their places of work, in their schools, in their universities, in their neighborhoods, right? In their families, to various actions that might add to this, as I said, widening these cracks of ending the era of Israeli impunity, and indeed thinking about a future that is, not based on Jewish supremacy, not based on oppression and violence, right? Indeed on genocide, but on a completely different kind of a world. But it has to start with, indeed, a completely different kind of education.
Yeah. And I think that education, as you're saying, for folks who are particularly U.S. racialized as white, Jewish folks who are engaging in this, it's going to have to be discomfort. You're going to have to sit in that discomfort, and it has to be disruptive, right? It can't be just an inquiry and learning and as normal, right? There has to be something about unmaking the world for you and disruptive for others.
Yeah. So again, this also goes back to how I described the connection between my academic work and this process that my personal process that I've outlined here, because this issue of discomfort, right, in many cases, for example, American Jews today, from different ideological positions, still portray it actually not as an issue of discomfort, but actually as an issue of safety, and they put it within the realm of anti-Semitism. So listening to the truth about Palestinians' lives and destruction and history and experience, right? All this is portrayed to them. They understand this as anti-Semitism, right? This conflation of a people and a state, whereas this is about Israel, not about Jews as a people, and it's about a documented reality, right? past and present. So this is also something that continuously needs to be highlighted, right? And we also see a movement in that. I think it's also generational, obviously, among American Jews, but we also see a movement in that people understand that they will be incredibly uncomfortable. I was incredibly uncomfortable, right? As I said, right, in this process of understanding that I actually grew up in a lie, right? Um, but this is not actually about their safety, right?
Right.
Not at all. Actually, you might even argue to the contrary, right? This, in very many ways, enhances their safety if they understand that Jews in Israel are not the same.